Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca, the Director of Product here at Elevate Network, and I'm your host for this afternoon. Thank you for joining us for Building Psychological Safety during this year's Mobilize Women Week. It's actually our 5th year hosting Mobilize Women, and we thank you so much for joining us today. For those of you who are new to Elevate, we're a coalition of ambitious, supportive women and allies who show up for each other, mobilizing to change the culture of business. Over the last 20 years, our focus has been really perfecting the art of safe spaces for women to be honest about work and get the validation, perspective, and actionable advice that we all need. So the entire Mobilize Women Week is designed with that idea in mind. It's a safe space for you to share your stories, your opinions, and to really challenge your perspectives. You'll hear from speakers from all different backgrounds, all who are excited to share their stories and their advice with you. So please, we ask that you listen to them with intent and with an open mind. We've actually carved out time during the week for you to really take what you hear and think about how it applies to your life, to really process it with others at our roundtables, our mentoring meetups, and our workshops throughout the rest of the week. We've seen that talking through and taking some of the lessons into a safe space is really the best way to really contextualize what you've heard and come up with a good plan of action. You'll really see there are other people here who care and who really want to help you make a meaningful change in the world. Before we dive in and before I get to a little housekeeping, we'd love to thank all of our sponsors for making this possible, especially our presenting sponsor, RBC Wealth Management. And now a few housekeeping items. One, please use the chat to talk to each other and to our speakers. You can share back the important things you hear to really amplify their message. You could drop helpful links to books or websites or apps. Let's really help each other get the most out of this conversation. Second, we're going to end with a Q&A. So you can post all of your questions in the Q&A box for us to see. And while you're there, you can click on the CC closed captions icon next to the Q&A box to toggle captions on and off or to view the full transcript from the session. Third, if need be, you can always privately message the Elevate team. We're identifiable as the host and co-host of the session, and we have Elevate right in our names. Fourth, and finally, we're recording the session and it will be posted on the website for you to watch again later. So we'll have that available for all of you. All right, thank you all for tuning in. And now please welcome Shireen Luce, Senior Director of U.S. Wealth Management Human Resources at RBC Wealth Management.
Hi, thank you so much, Rebecca, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone out there. I am so thrilled to be here with you today at this incredible conference. I am the head of HR for RBC Wealth Management US. As you heard, we're one of the sponsors of today's event. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, RBC Wealth Management is a global financial services firm, and we have about 15,000 employees globally and about 5,500 here in the US. As head of HR, my job is to look out for the health and well-being of all of those employees. And it's a job I am passionate about. And it is also one that has stretched me and taught me that as a senior leader, I have a lot to learn about many things, but especially about showing vulnerability at work. An encounter with a female colleague completely changed my perspective on how I should be leading. This new mom had returned from maternity leave not 6 months prior, and she was in our office, just for a touch base meeting. And before getting down to business, as I standardly do, I asked how she was doing. She started to answer with, "Oh, I'm great," providing a few details about baby and how she was adjusting to motherhood. But before she got too far, the tears started welling up in her eyes, and it was really clear she wasn't okay. Overwhelmed with the demands of work and life, she confessed that she was at her breaking point, and she couldn't figure out how to get it all done, caring for a newborn, herself, and her job. All of a sudden, she paused and she looked carefully at me and she said, I'm sorry. You must think I'm such a disaster. You always have it so together, and here I am, a total mess. In my head, I was like, wait, what? Me? You think I have it together? I'm a total disaster. Unbeknownst to her, or really anyone, I was the woman who found herself in the psych ward after the birth of my first child. I was the woman with severe, sometimes debilitating anxiety. And I was the woman who felt like continuing failing on all fronts. But because of this facade I had put on, no one knew my struggles. All they saw was what I let them see. Even after the birth of my first child, I pretended I had it all together. My house was spotless, my baby was Gerber baby material, and I was perfectly coiffed and ready for prime time every day. It wasn't until I stopped sleeping and lost almost 30 pounds in 2 weeks that I realized something was wrong. Even then, I didn't want to admit it, not even to my husband. Things got so bad one day that I had no choice. I called my doctor and I confessed to her that something was off. And she promptly sent me to the psychiatric emergency room. And that's where I received my diagnosis, severe postpartum anxiety. Along with that diagnosis, I got a prescription for anti-anxiety medication, and with it, a huge rush of shame. I was so embarrassed and I was so disappointed in myself. So much so that I didn't share my diagnosis with anyone but my husband, not even my family. But in that moment, in my office, with that new mom pouring her heart out to me, I realized that as a leader, I can't hide my imperfections. I need to acknowledge them, talk about them, and even celebrate them. As leaders, we have far more visibility than we do as rank and file employees. What we say and do is magnified, and it's often taken as an example. By putting up this facade that I was perfect and had it all together, I was essentially telling our employees that they had to be too. Of course, this was never my intent or expectation. I know I have never looked at another colleague and thought, why are you such a mess? Get your act together. But that was the impression my facade was giving. So it was on that day, I made a conscious decision to be more vulnerable and authentic as a leader. But don't get me wrong, it isn't easy. As women, we are hardwired to hide our imperfections because at work, where we're often not starting from an equal place anyway, we fear those imperfections are going to get in the way of our advancement. Gen X and baby boomer women in particular, we were taught we had to be 10 times smarter, we had to work 10 times harder to succeed. And that meant never acknowledging that we were struggling with family commitments or that we were overwhelmed or simply having a bad day. In short, we all had to be superwomen. Superwoman is not real. And neither are these perfect personas we're building. While these facades may have helped us rise in our own careers, what we didn't realize in creating them was the incredible disservice that we were doing to our younger generations of women who look up to us and are modeling our behavior. So that's why today I'm modeling behavior that is much more authentic. Sometimes I'll walk into meetings and I'll just say, today's hard and I'm not managing it well. And it's really important for us as leaders to acknowledge and own we're human too and multidimensional and failing in some places. In fact, I have so embraced this need to be more vulnerable and real that I keep telling our head of communications that I want to start a blog that's called Failing on All Fronts, because that's how I feel. The good news, I think, is that this pandemic has made authenticity and vulnerability quite a bit easier. As work shifted from the office to home, and in-person meetings have been replaced with Zoom video calls, the chaos like this of our daily lives, it's been put on full display, whether we want it to be or not, for both men and women. And I'm speaking from personal experience. Early on in the pandemic, I was on a video call like this with about 14 members of my team. My then 5-year-old son just kept knocking on my door. When he finally came in, he told me that the toilet was plugged, and he thought, I'm just going to keep flushing to see if it gets better. Of course, that resulted in toilet water spewing all over the floor. So my team was treated to me running frantically through my house to find the mess. Grab the plunger and I'm trying to unplug my toilet. All at the same time, my dear, dear son has his shoes on and is stomping through 4 rooms, tracking toilet water the whole step of the way. And I'm sure my team got a glimpse of that too. You know, had that happened a few years ago, I would have been mortified. In fact, I know I would have gone out of my way to make sure nobody saw it. But vulnerability in leadership requires us to let our guard down. So I did, and I encourage all leaders, female leaders in particular, to do so too. And I can tell you from experience that it's actually quite freeing and kind of funny. But vulnerability, it does more than enable our employees to be their authentic selves at work. Vulnerability also promotes psychological safety, which is exceedingly important in today's workplace. It's why we're all here today, right? Psychological safety, that's that feeling that you can speak up or speak out when something's not quite right, or when there's an opportunity to do better. And this idea was first written about by William Kahn and popularized by Amy Edmondson at Harvard Business School. Her research, she found that when employees feel safe, they trust to admit mistakes, seek feedback, and even to fail without dire consequences. And for those of you skeptics, believe it or not, there's a business case for psychological safety. A 2-year study at Google found that feeling secure enough to contribute was the most common feature by far of high-performing teams. Unfortunately, as the New York Times pointed out in an article this spring, it's often women, and especially women of color, who don't feel psychologically safe in their workplaces. And sadly, the horrendous events of 2020, namely the pandemic, murders of Black men such as George Floyd that happened right here in my hometown of Minneapolis, and a spate of hate crimes perpetrated against Asian Americans has only made this worse. It is critical to give employees of color the confidence that they can speak up and share that they're struggling with the repeated trauma that racial violence is having on their communities, their families, and their own mental health. It's just as important to give them the safe space to talk about these things as it is to give that new mom the confidence to say that they're struggling with new demands. At RBC Wealth Management, we as leaders, we made a conscious decision to proactively acknowledge these traumas and messages to our employees. We did it after the murder of George Floyd, and we did it in response to attacks against Asian Americans. We also realized we needed to do a better job of creating space for employees of color to be heard. We launched a series of listening sessions that we call Real Chats, where employees of colors can come together, talk, to grieve, and to support one another. And I'm going to be honest, some of the feedback, particularly regarding their experience at our firm, was alarming and really painful to hear. But we resolved as leaders to be vulnerable, to listen, and more importantly, to use what we heard so we can improve. This is just the beginning. We have a long way to go, but I am hopeful. I am hopeful that as more leaders let down their guard and allow themselves to be more vulnerable and lead from an authentic place, all employees will feel like they can be too. Thank you, and I'm going to turn it back over to Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Shireen, for joining us today and your true vulnerable honesty and sharing your story with all of us. I think it shows all of us how we need to acknowledge and, as you said, really celebrate all of our imperfections as leaders, and is the perfect start to this conversation. I'm going to hand it over now to our moderator, Daisy O'Shea Dominguez, who is the Chief People Officer at Vice Media Group, and our 3 panelists, Elizabeth Nieto, Global Head of Equity and Impact at Spotify, the head of diversity, inclusion, belonging, and access at Upwork, and Gabriela Rosen-Kellerman, the chief product officer at BetterUp.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Absolutely thrilled to be here. Before I get started, I want to share my deep gratitude to Shireen for sharing her truth as a leader and as a colleague today, and allowing us to share our truth thanks to her vulnerability and her honesty. I feel like I have a fail moment every day. And guess what? One happened while Shireen was speaking, because I had a package at the door, my husband in the backyard working, and my daughter's music blaring, and nobody could go pick it up. And so I had to run as fast as I could upstairs in the middle of this and beg that Shireen was not done with her speech before I got back. So we absolutely have all fail moments every single day. Guess what? Every single one of us has them. I can't tell you how excited I am to join Gabriela, Elizabeth, and Erin for a chat about psychological safety and what it means for all of us in our workplaces. In my day job, as Rebecca mentioned, as Chief People Officer at Vice Media Group, I talk often about psychological safety and what it means in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and fundamentally the impact that all of these have on organizational performance. So I'm excited to hear from these terrific speakers today. I'm ready to learn more. I hope you all are. So let's dive in, right? Let's start with language. The language that we use and our definitions matter. And Shireen started explaining a bit of the background around psychological safety. I'd love to get grounded by hearing from all of our speakers. What is psychological safety and why does it matter? Gabriela, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thanks so much, Daisy. Wonderful to be here with everyone today to talk about this topic, which is near and dear to my heart personally, for sure. So psych safety is something we have studied for a while as a research community. Better researched and studied than belonging, although that is now increasingly being researched and studied, and we're doing quite a lot of that research at BetterUp. Psychologically safe environment, to Shireen's story and her point about vulnerability, is one where we feel we can be vulnerable and where we feel we can be rewarded for being vulnerable. So right now, in all the comments that are coming in for Shireen around her story, I think we're all trying to show up in a way that says, we appreciate your vulnerability. It's helpful to us, we're grateful for it, and help her feel rewarded for having shared that with us. It's also an environment where we feel okay taking risks, especially interpersonal risks. And when it's present, we see this really dramatic impact on employee satisfaction, on innovation. And we see that at both the individual and the team level. I'll just share one other piece here that I think is important, which is what psych safety is not. So it's not performative, right? It's not about like surface level niceties. It's not about groupthink and kind of consensus level decision making. It's also not about coddling people. It's about getting to a place where we can be our authentic selves, really be vulnerable together. That's quite deep. It's quite real. And it's not just about kind of being polite together. That distinction is where a lot of psych safety efforts can fall down. And it takes some inner work to get there and to be able to validate that what's happening is more than kind of what we call California politeness. I'm a native Californian, we're very polite. Out in New York, you will not see that as much. So for those on the East Coast, and how do we help create a cultural space where, for sure, we all want to be kind to each other, but where there's a deeper connection that we can actually let down our guard and come into our HR partner like Shireen and say, actually, I'm not okay today.
Thank you, Gabriela. That was really thoughtful. And I do think it's important sometimes when we're defining words, as you did, to explain what it is and what it isn't, because we often use language, and I often like to remind people, I was like, what do you mean when you say that word? Because when I say it, it may not mean the same thing. Erin and Elizabeth, do you have anything else to add I want to just make sure if there's anything else that I think Gabriela did a great job, but is there any other way that you particularly describe the concept within your organizations?
Sure. Yeah, I agree. It's a great job. And I saw, during Shireen's sharing a lot of call outs to the book, there's a little glare, but that's Amy Edmondson's book, The Fearless Organization, on the shelf there that I would recommend to everyone. I think another important layer to psych safety is, it's not just sharing without fear of, concern, not just sharing without fear of costs, but also there not being costs. And it's both the reality and the perception, because if the perception is there, then that is people's reality. And so, I see a lot of organizations fall flat there where, maybe we're sending the wrong signals without our awareness. But if those are being internalized by employees, then that is a problem. That is a challenge. And so just to add on a little bit more, closing that perception gap is also often an area of opportunity for organizations where, signals might be being interpreted in ways unintended. And so getting to the root of that can be really healthy to unlock that potential for innovation and safety that we're describing.
Absolutely. And I wonder, Elizabeth, I'll get to you around the definition also, but I'm also thinking about in terms of the role that you play in your organization. We talk about psychological safety in a lot of different concepts, and we know that when we're talking about diversity and inclusion, we're now starting to use that language more. So I wonder, what role does or should it play in your company's DEI, DEIB, whatever acronym you choose to use in your organization? Oh, you're muted, Elizabeth. That is the word for the last for these 2 years.
I thought someone was taking care of that, but it was me. So responsibility and accountability here for muting and unmuting. I think that the definition, we got to the point. I like this idea of the risk. And I think that organizations that really base on innovation, they're not doing this just because it's the right thing to do. It's because you can't innovate unless you take risks, unless you can be in a meeting and push back to whoever has more seniority or tenure and bring another idea. So psychologically safety now, it's needed for the business. It's just not only because it is important for diversity, inclusion, and belonging, and at the end of the day, the outcome of equity. So I can see why this conversation is going deeper, because this idea for many of us, and it was very interesting, Shireen, when she talked about showing yourself. I grew up in an environment where failure was not rewarded from my childhood on. So every time that I will go to a panel and someone said, tell us about your failure. And I would say, I'm not, sorry, that's not what I do. And it really took me along, because the word failure is such a strong word versus, I'd make mistakes, I committed errors, I learned through the process, I took risks. So for me, going back to your language, the word failure, it's not where I'm comfortable. The word risk is where I'm very comfortable. And I can think about my career from a risk perspective and not from failure perspective. And I think that when we change that, and again, some other people may feel very comfortable with that. And that's why, diversity means that you select the way and inclusion, the way that you want to communicate. But that's where I see the need for psychological safety for the business environment of innovation.
I think that's brilliant. And in terms of the work that you do for diversity, equity, and inclusion, what role do you think it should play beyond the business component, but the actual DEI strategy? Or perhaps, what you're saying is that they're one and the same.
Yeah, and I think that today is the foundation of what we do in diversity, inclusion, belonging, equity, because without that, you can't really move into what we want to do is have those difficult conversations, those places where we don't know the answers and you need the others. And for you to be able to do that, you have to create an environment of being curious, open to learning, being challenged about your thinking. So I see this as the foundation of diversity, inclusion, equity, belonging.
That's real. I fully agree. And it's, as we use these words, sometimes I think the danger of it is that we use them interchangeably, and we shouldn't. And Aaron, I I spend a lot of my time, as I'm sure you do, defining terms. And, and I talk to our teams about inclusion being, when people of different backgrounds feel that their voice matters and that they are included in meetings, decision-making, minor and major events, right? And then we also talk about equity as, this tool for addressing structures and systems and historical legacies that, that allow us to ensure that everyone has access to the same opportunities, resources, and outcomes. So what do you think is the relationship between psychological safety and this newish term that we're using more commonly now of belonging?
Sure. Yes, there's always a term du jour. So again, on this thread of defining and demarcating, I think it's really important. At Upwork, we define belonging as a feeling of fit without having to sacrifice meaningful aspects of your identity. And I think that really ties into what Shireen shared around, the facade, the mask, the covering that every single, person does. Like, we're always shape-shifting and code switching in different environments. Sometimes that's to meet or mirror or match a customer. Sometimes it's because how you show up with your closest colleague is not how you show up with your CEO. And that's a good thing. But that identity piece is really crucial because, when we kind of link this to psychological safety, these things go hand in hand. And you can't have an environment where, risk-taking, open sharing, flagging things before they're fully baked or concluded is happening equitably if folks aren't showing up authentically, right? The input to that safety is not going to be the real, ingredient that you're looking for. And so I think, it's really important to think about almost belonging as a precursor to psychological safety, because if folks are feeling safe, but in a constrained or assimilated way, then you're not getting that goodness, that value proposition of diverse teams or organizations out of the safe environment that you've cultivated. So I think that's a little bit of the interplay. I think an important distinction, but if we bind that all together, we're really talking about folks showing up as themselves and then contributing fully, honestly, candidly, without having to filter or censor. And I think we all want that.
Yes, we do. And I think we often forget how much this work is really about what we all crave all the time, and how we have taken a little bit of the human out of the human work that we do. And we're trying to bring that back to organizations. Elizabeth, I'm curious from your vantage point, part of creating psychological safety is also the sense of creating equity in organizations, making sure everyone feels equally safe within organizational culture. Who influences psychological safety and belonging the most in companies? Where does that come from? Does it come from the top, the bottom, the middle?
I would say yes and yes and yes, because it really becomes from the culture. In some cases, it's really created by a CEO or a founder, but it's the water you're in. And that allows for all of us to be able to feel comfortable to take risks in the different environments. So I think that, yes, obviously in many of our organizations that are much more hierarchical, the senior leaders determine the tone, but what they determine the tone is a tone of the culture where people can feel and can have these opportunities to push a little bit more if they don't agree, or ensure that they come with new ideas because they represent customers that are not being represented by others. And the culture allows for us. So I'm a big believer that, the culture, yes, it gets shaped by senior leadership, but it really takes form by all, especially in organizations that have values of transparency and engagement. We talk at Spotify that leadership is a group sport. But because, and we're part of the band, we have a lot of these beautiful ideas. There's not one soloist. It's really a band. And in the band, everybody has to play their part. They have to also listen to the other ones and respect the other ones. So if you think about that as the metaphor of the environment that you want to create, it's everybody's accountability.
Even those of us who haven't played sports understand that.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. You can either play sports or play on the band. You can choose one of the two.
I love it. And Elizabeth, within that family of of cohorts within an organization, if you will, what can managers do to ensure that they're creating psychological safety? Because within all of our unique responsibilities, managers' roles are to ensure the wholeness of their individual teams and to manage workflows, right? I always tell folks, this is fundamentally the two things that managers should be doing. What do you think managers can do to ensure psychological safety within their teams?
Yes, I'm going to follow some of the things that we all heard or we've seen in Amy's book of Fearless Organization. It's really how you show up with humility. And that's something that, depending on your cultural background or your expectations, you may need to practice to do that for that environment. How you look at curiosity, so how you learn for others, but a real engagement in the learning, and how you practice empathy. So I think that those three start to foster some expectation. I love this, we talk about vulnerability as one of the aspects of that. For me, is that how you listen as a manager and how you ask questions. And I think that this medium of all of us in 2 dimensions, not 3 dimensions, makes it much more important now to engage in different ways. The water cooler, the getting the coffee together, the ways that we were finding ways to engage are not there. So we have to create them. During last summer, I got a little bit, a good call out from one of my team members, because she said there was so much going on. As we all know, you're just going for the agenda, and maybe we need to put 10 minutes in the agenda just not to have an agenda. And I took that to heart, and really, I'm now putting the effort of the same conversations that I would have had as we were walking into a conference room to create that space. And that is a way to show that I really care. I listen. I'm invested in whatever is happening to you today. So that's an extra layer given by the circumstances on how to show and create that psychological safety.
I think that's a great example, Elizabeth. And I think all of us, even the most natural leaders this year, have been called to rethink the way that we manage and lead teams. I've started a new practice. I meet with my HR leadership team every 2 weeks, and we have a reflection question before we get started. So we spend 15 minutes, sometimes we spend 25 minutes on it, but it's anything from, if you could live anywhere in the world, where would it be and why, to, what are you letting go of this week because there's so much on your plate. And it allows us to build that shared sense of humanity. And I always answer, right? I don't just ask my team. I was like, I have an answer for that as well. And it's allowed us to build connective tissue. And then we go into the business after that. And then, and then we go into solutioning and solving. But we've had this kind of moment of being human, remembering that we're human, remembering the human and human resources, and then going into the work that we're doing. So I think that's a great tip. Gabriela, segueing from the human, let's talk the metrics. Let's talk the data. There are many metrics for diversity and inclusion, and it's been a field that for a long time was thought to be hard to quantify, and now there's a lot of different analytics and metrics being defined. But how do you measure belonging? This concept that feels more subjective, and even psychological safety. How do you help organizations and individuals think about measuring that?
Yeah, it's such a great question, and it's really so important. I think that the addition of belonging to the ever-growing acronym of DEIB, it tells us that there's something missing that we weren't able to measure with just the DEI. And it does have to do with that internal experience. It is inherently subjective, as Erin said, it's, do I feel that sense of fit? Do I feel that I identify with the organization? For some people, it's about, do I feel I matter to the organization? The fact that it's subjective doesn't mean that we can't measure it objectively. So this is a big part of what all of psychology is about, is how do we objectively measure internal subjective experiences. There's a whole field of psychometrics that's all about doing that. And people who love that can talk to you all day about how we go through many, many steps to validate. But basically what you do is you come up with language, then you test it cross-culturally with tens or hundreds of thousands of people to determine that this question or this set of questions is going to reliably predict that internal experience that we're after. But ultimately, that's exactly what it comes down to, is asking people the question of, do you feel you belong in this workplace, as validated with very specific language. It's super, super important, but ultimately, like, that is the way that you get at whether people are feeling that. And it's a very important leading indicator of whether people actually intend to stay at your organization because they feel good there.
That's so wonderful to hear, Gabriela. And and I think that sometimes we overthink it and are not sure of what questions to ask, and we forget about the validation of data and using experts like you to help us identify the right questions. Thank you so much. Let me pivot a little bit because it's the question that we all have lived this past year, which is, how do we prioritize psychological safety when we're struggling with threats to our safety and our health posed by the pandemic that we've all just lived through? It can be hard to do that. And so I wonder, Erin, when you think about the profound effect on mental health that this past year has had on all of us, including myself, when you hear and you read these articles that are talking about the Great Resignation, right? That I call it the corporate reshuffling, because people are really just going somewhere else. They just don't want to be where they are. When you hear about people languishing, being depleted, I call it burnt crispy, right? We're not burnt out, we're burnt crispy. How do you feel that the pandemic has eroded psychological safety, and how can all of us as individuals, as managers or leaders, support our people as we come out of this period of isolation while also taking care of ourselves?
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot there. I think, how did we get here is very layered. And if you think about how responsive, reactive most companies, pretty much all companies, had to be to everything the external environment was throwing at them for the past 18 months, a lot of orgs were trying to do the same amount or even more, depending on the nature of their business, with less, less time, less predictability, fewer resources. And, I think a byproduct of that for a lot of companies was, was perhaps an erasure of some of the rituals, the routines, the structures that might have been signals for or forums for cultivating psychological safety. And I think that's a layer on top of, and in addition to what Elizabeth was talking about, beyond individual actions, you can structure, you can bake into a meeting, you can bake into a company town hall, these opportunities to get more vulnerable, to flag risks, and really have that be part of your operating model. But who had a ton of organizational time for that last year, right? So I think that's part of possibly how we've gotten here, and that combination of, really high expectations with low psych safety is a perfect recipe. It's the recipe for anxiety and the burnout that ensues. So we're here and we're starting to get back into the office, or, some of us are starting to travel for work meetings or retreats or things of that nature. On top of that, we are, a lot of us, going to be remote for the long haul. And so, we're not necessarily coming back to some of those built-in little protocols and structures, like the water cooler, or the 15 minutes in the conference room or waiting for the room to open. So what can we do? I think the underpinning here is again, humanity and the emotionality that we've been touching on. And I would love to see more companies and leaders therein carving out space for processing and grieving what has been lost. I think a lot of companies have done a decent job of providing individual and personal supports, more mental health benefits, increased number of sessions with a coach or a therapist. That's wonderful and necessary. But what about the collective losses, right? A lot of companies are completely reshaped, reshuffled, downsized, completely reimagined, which is amazing in terms of agility, but colleagues went away, whole departments went away. The business is different from perhaps what it was, 2 years ago. And I don't know how many orgs have created an opportunity for groups, teams, the whole company to honor what's been done away with. And I think, we can't really come to closure. We can't pretend like the past 18 months didn't happen without some sort of ritual to kind of mark the gravity of the trauma that we've all gone through. So that would be phenomenal. I think for companies to cultivate. And then for leaders, how do we, help others and help ourselves kind of get back into the swing of things? I think we've already answered that question. I think it comes back to being really honest and clear on what we want and need, signaling that as transparently as possible, being models and beacons for folks who are lower power in our organizations. Because if we can't take that time off, be very, very loud about the time off and what we're doing with it, if we can't triage and prioritize and pull back on work that needs to be put aside, like you said, Daisy, then no one else will feel safe doing that. And so I think there's real power in leaders taking care of themselves, having enough insight into themselves to do that, and then broadcasting that to the organization or at least to their teams so that, again, it's safer for that shadow to be cast and for the whole org to be brought along.
Thank you so much, Erin. There's so much that I love about what you just said. In particular, I'm reminded when you're talking about this concept of rituals and recognizing what we've lost and what we've gained. And there's been a bit of both. And I'm reminded when I worked at Google, one of my colleagues launched this amazing initiative at X, and in honor of Dia de los Muertos, which is a Mexican tradition where you honor those who have passed. And it was a day where everybody came with all their projects that were dead, that were no longer going to go anywhere in the world. But they had been their babies, right? They had worked on them sometimes for years, and they were going nowhere. And it was this beautiful moment of recognition, and an altar was created, and it's become this annual tradition now in the organization. And I feel like we do need those moments to actually acknowledge it. I think you're right, we acknowledge it in small moments, but as humans, rituals are meaningful. There's a reason why they exist. And there's a reason why we can do that in a meaningful way. So I'm thinking now, how do we bring that back? Thanks for the reminder, Erin. Elizabeth, continuing on the theme of this past year, which has been the most impossible of years, you've said that 2020 made it very clear that we need to change systems and institutions, not individuals. How do we achieve this kind of systemic change? What are the structures that need to be rethought in order to foster real and lasting change?
Yeah, and I will go back to the decades that we started in diversity, when it was just diversity, and we were fixing the women so they could go up the ladder. And we were doing that, believing that that's what we needed to do. We needed to explain to women how to get through the organization, assuming the organizations were not going to change. So if you wanted to go ahead, you needed to be what they wanted them to be. And I think that the last year has shown us that, yes, you can learn how to be successful in an organization, but the question is, can we change the way things work? And we did, because a couple of years ago, we started looking at job descriptions, and we realized that the language that we were using were getting us the kind of candidate because it was really targeted. And the more neutral that we got into the language, we were opening that to different talent. Many companies, we review what meritocracy meant. Was there really meritocracy? And, I can't imagine many companies that are really progressive and innovative today not thinking their own performance management processes and questioning and investigating how they did it, or the promotion. So I think that we are at a moment saying we don't have to get people that may not be part of the majority and assimilate completely. What we want is to know how this organization works and help us change that to a place where more people of any kind can progress. So that's why I see this. And again, you can think about the candidate and employee cycle, and inspect each one of the processes or systems that you have in your organization, and questioning, when were they created? Who were they created for? And what is today the impact of those? And maybe you may be in an organization that has solved for all of those, but most of us have some work to do.
I'd say all of us have a lot of work to do on that front. We've tinkered. I think, Elizabeth, you'll say we've tinkered around the margins on this work, but we haven't really dug into the real root causes of these, because it's hard.
Yeah.
And for those who are listening, I've known Elizabeth for a long time. She's been a pioneer in this work and leading this work. And I often, when there's the double-edged sword of like, oh, but you've been at this for so long and we haven't fixed it. And I'm like, let me explain to you why this hasn't been fixed. So Elizabeth,
we're also evolving in this practice. Yeah, we're also evolving in this practice. But I think that the people that are successful in this practice are the ones that realize, like we were saying before, that they don't know all the answers, and that's why you bring other people that help you build those answers.
Absolutely. Thank you, Elizabeth. It really is. It's just constantly pivoting and and building on what we've done. Gabriela, research has shown that more than 40% of people feel physically and emotionally isolated in the workplace. And through this last year, this figure has increased. What can we as individuals, and again, depending on the role that we play in organizations, whether we're individual contributors, managers, leaders, what can we do to change this when we might be feeling the exact same way?
Yeah, it's such an important question, Daisy. Before the pandemic, we are already in an epidemic of loneliness here in the United States. And the pandemic has worsened that tremendously. And often what gets focused on are the people who are really severely ill, who for sure really need that help. And it's emergent, it's a crisis. And my background's in psychiatry, so I spent a lot of my career taking care of folks who are really severely ill. But I think what this pandemic has allowed us and really forced us to take a long, hard look at is the fact that we're all struggling at some level. Increasingly, we're seeing the term languishing out there. Adam Grant, one of our advisors and our collaborators on research, wrote a beautiful op-ed on this, all about how, this blah feeling that we've all felt at some point during the pandemic, or maybe most of the pandemic, languishing is the word to describe that. Our research shows that at any given time, about 55% of the workforce is languishing. So most of the workforce is falling into that category at any given time. And being in that category, it doesn't just mean that we're not feeling our best. It also means we're more at risk for some of those more severe conditions. It has implications, for our performance. If we're managing others, it has implications for the teams that we lead. And so how do we actually help shift the curve of distribution of well-being so that fewer and fewer people are languishing, more are flourishing, and therefore in a position to be resilient in the face of challenge, and to also lead others to be greater and achieve their potential? We focus a lot on the manager in this regard. And so we think managers are really the most under-leveraged tool in thinking about organizational well-being, because what matters more for your well-being at work than your relationship with your manager? Very little, right? And how equipped is your manager to actually help you with those things? How equipped is your manager to do practices like yours, Daisy, of opening with these questions of vulnerability? And if you're yourself a manager, how equipped do you feel to help others? And your level of resilience is actually going to predict your team's entire level of resilience, your team's entire level of innovation, your team's likelihood of burning out, your team's likelihood of turnover. All of that there's a huge amount of that's predicted by your level of resilience as a manager. So this has obviously been a huge part of the focus of our coaching throughout the pandemic. I think the other thing worth mentioning, which we haven't spoken about yet at the panel, is the role of community and of groups in helping shore us up during this time. So we've seen one of our offerings is a group coaching offering. This is something that's just been like flying off the shelves in the pandemic, because people are looking for ways not just to grow their skills, but to form these internal networks within the organization that they didn't have before. Chevron was a company that was entering a restructuring right as the pandemic hit. And what happened was, once it hit, we added on these groups, these group coaching circles to that offering. They had employees from Dubai in the same circles with employees from India, and the same circles with people from Western Europe, all coming together, forming relationships and connections they didn't have before. So in addition to being able to grow skills like resilience, they were shoring up that social connection, that sense of support. that social connection certainly predicts resilience, but it's also a huge component of belonging. So all of those things kind of end up coming back together by way of our sense of community and support.
Can I jump in? I love this so much.
I love anybody on the panel. Yes.
I love this so much. Yes. I think just toggling back to what Elizabeth was talking about earlier, especially being remote, right? And just, I'm seeing that in the chat as well. We are by ourselves and this does not change that. And so convening is going to be, I think, an org design principle that will be foundational moving forward. Again, as most companies stay some version of remote, be it hybrid or completely. And I love the power of these circles. I've heard about them before, Gabriela. So I'm a big fan. And I think just toggling back to the diversity space. Even thinking about any existing communities or groups that you already have, like if you have belonging communities, if you have employee resource groups, if you have built-in touch points, bringing some of the skill building into where people are already meeting is a great way to kind of create this wraparound ecosystem that, to your point, can shore us up for the long haul.
Yeah, I love that so much, Erin. And one thing that we've seen a lot during the pandemic is also the extent to which, our identities are so multifaceted. And so it's probably not going to be any one single group. And also there's going to be time-bound groups that need to spring up. So how do we create an environment in organizations where these things can organically spring up, and then it's okay if they sort of mellow out after a while. So you can then focus like, today I really need support as a parent. Today I really need support as a Latina. Today I really need support as a global employee working remotely right now. And all of those things are important and challenging at different times in different ways. But that sort of dynamic nature is a big part of what we're seeing organizations needing to solve for now, rather than like one core static identity.
I think that's such a smart and important point, because I hear that a lot from our employees, of this sense of it being so static. I can only belong to one group. We call them community groups at Vice Media Group, or employee resource group. And the fact of the matter is that we all walk around with multiple identities, some of which are more privileged than others, some of which are more marginalized than others, some of which are require more need than others. And being able to, as you say, Gabriela, to be able to find those spaces where you will find that nourishment and that support, and know that you can go here today and there tomorrow. I think that's going to be a really critical piece of how we shift our perception of convenings and groupings and communities. That's just such an important point. Well, we're almost about to go to your live questions, but before we go there, I thought I'd give all of our panelists a minute or two to share their parting words. I think, these are some of, I'm not going to give the summary because you're our panelists, but these are the words that I've been hearing resoundingly throughout this conversation: vulnerability, authenticity, modeling behavior, community, intentionality, managers' resilience, predictability. These are some of those words that I'm taking with me from today. But Elizabeth, we'll start with you and then I'll go to Erin and Gabriela. What are some of the parting words that you'd like to share with this amazing audience today?
Something that Gabriela said really triggered this idea that managers matter. And the way that you choose a job, sometimes you choose the job for the content of the job, but what matters is the relationship, the development that you get from that manager. So balancing not just the job because of the job itself, but finding the right manager. And that may not be that easy, but if you're in an organization, you know who those are, and follow those managers, because in moments of crisis, they are the ones that are going to determine your success in the performance of your job, but also in the future of your career. So thank you, Gabriela, for that. Trigger some thoughts.
Yes. Erin?
Sure. Yeah, I think that some of the flavor of what we've talked about today has been around, what those, especially in power, can do to cultivate safety and, amplify belonging. And I saw some questions even about like, well, what about this scenario? What about that scenario? And I think sometimes as individuals, we might approach this as some huge endeavor to find safe spaces within our organizations, to find those communities, to find those pockets. And before you try to like carve out your own psych safety pathway or belonging pathway, I would just encourage every single person to just audit the spaces, to your point, the people, the places within your existing, day-to-day work experience where you do feel great, where you can show up fully you. I have my closest work friend who I consider a real life friend as well, where literally all I do is text her, girl, that's it. And then we know it's time to get together, something's up, right? Like, do you have that within your organization or a proxy for that? And examine what it is about those individuals, what it is about those types of meetings, those leaders that bring out the best in you, and take that information and use it perhaps to springboard into recommendations in other settings where you don't feel like you're quite in that pocket or flow. So rather than trying to start from nothing, just hopefully you have at least one person or one type of touch point within your company where you do feel great and you do feel free. Take that and use it to create a blueprint for other spaces as well.
I love that. Thank you, Erin. Gabriela?
And one of the things that we know about how we can create a greater sense of belonging and safety for others is by sharing our own experiences, sharing our own sense of vulnerability, sharing our perspective, really. And I think that as a community of women in particular, we have so much to offer our teams, our organizations, our friends, our communities, as leaders in how to create those psychologically safe spaces to help people feel they belong. It requires drawing from those deepest values, and Shireen set the tone beautifully today, to get in touch with your own sense of authenticity, your own sense of vulnerability, draw from that strength, draw from the intuitive gifts that you uniquely have, and make sure that you're sharing that. Make sure that that's the place that you're leading from. And that's the place that will help to create that sense of belonging and safety for others.
It's terrific. I could talk to the three of you all day long. I'm actually reminded, as all of you were speaking, I sent my team a set of questions this week as we're thinking about our second half of this year to really, pivot on what we thought we were going to be doing, because the world has changed and there's new guidelines every day and we're shifting along with it. And I asked them to answer these questions. What are the spaces that light you up? How can we free you up to find the right balance between what you love to do, what you have to do, what meetings or projects you have to be in, and where can we wean people off unnecessary and unproductive work? I don't know what answers I'm going to get. I'm happy to share them with all of you afterwards. But the intent behind that was to give my team a sense of agency over what, because we haven't had agency this past year and a half, right? Everything's come at us. And I think part of creating psychological safety, it's also ensuring that we have a sense of agency of going like, this isn't working, Daisy, right? It's like this, like you're throwing too much at us and here's what we need to do. And there's things that we have to do, right? That I can't change, but there's also things that we can do a lot better and that we can try and not to do. So you've all reminded me that, that was my set of questions for the week. But we have received tons of great questions from this audience. So I'm going to ask these, and I'm going to group these together, this first set of questions, because a lot of them have been centered around what to do under difficult management, we'll say, which is, not the best, and many of us can have examples around that. So I'll ask the questions, and then I think each of our panelists will have some gems to share. The first is, how do you achieve psychological safety when you realize there is unconscious bias by your manager or other management in the group? So that's around unconscious bias. The second one is, how do you not get drained yourself and continue to support others around you, knowing that the narcissistic, I'm just saying the question verbatim, the narcissistic CEO could care less about anyone's psychological safety. So that question is around the difference between what you say you do and how employees really experience you. And then the third one is, my supervisor has shared a great deal of her postpartum journey to find work-life balance. And now it is every interaction. I have so much empathy, but now I'm approaching empathy burnout. and I don't feel like I have a supervisor. So that's the burnout of, I want you to be my manager. And, how do we create psychological safety for all of us involved? So the first question around unconscious bias, who wants to take that one? I'll pick one. Okay, Elizabeth, I'll pick you. So how do you achieve psychological safety when you realize there is unconscious bias by your manager or other management in the group?
So I don't think that you can really get psychological safety if people are not coming into respecting you for who you are. So that's like it's a difficult one. Now, are there any signals that person can be educated about how some of their biases are impacting the work? And that could be like the first conversation. Do they know enough about your group or whatever bias they have? We know that in many cases, and it's not a past, but people come to the biases from ignorance. So they come from stories that they never sat down to reflect if they were truth or not, or how they came to be the way that they understand the world. So if there's any chance that whoever's answered the question, someone else, maybe not you, if you're the one who are perceiving that the bias is against your group, but someone else in the group could be an advocate for understanding how that manager is creating an environment that it's not really open to innovating, creating risk, performing at a better way. Maybe that, it's a more developed bystander approach where you have someone else communicating with their manager some of the things that they're not doing, or they're not creating an environment for safety.
That's so important. Being able to lean on somebody to help you, right? Because it's hard to do it when it's yourself. Yes.
Yeah, can I add to that one too?
Please.
It is really hard, and there's a clear power dynamic there if it's your manager, right? And so, I think something every single person can do is just push for clarity, push for clear expectations, and then bring your receipts around what you've done or not against that. Because if the structure, if the expectations, if the outcomes are airtight, it leaves little room for bias to at least affect your professional outcomes. It doesn't mean you feel great, which I agree goes back to pulling in, allies, pulling in upstanders, pulling in HR. But if it's around performance, that's where, just bring the facts. And it can be really easy to see where either expectations are misaligned or unclear, or for that manager to see where they're filling in gaps around things that are not what you've agreed to deliver. So I always like to lead with the data.
Lead with the data. I'm going to ask each of you to say quickly, because I think each of you will probably have a very unique take on how do you not get drained yourself, right? When you have someone who could care less about what you really care about, because I would venture to say that we have all been there. Gabriela, do you have an answer for that?
Yeah, sure. So, this is something that there's a parallel to it in that world of healthcare that's all around caregiver burnout. How do you make sure that you're taking care of yourself even while you're taking care of someone else? Now, in the workplace, we're not intended to be caregivers, and so that already tells you there's some sort of boundary being crossed versus people who that's actually what they're being paid to do is be givers of empathy. This is where boundaries is the key word, right? So if you're in that relationship with your manager, how long are you spending in your one-on-ones listening and, being the shoulder to cry on versus being able to raise up what you need to raise up? Are you able to kind of take control of those moments and say, okay, I have actually a lot of things I need your help with. Can we shift into some of the work stuff? Are you able to share with that person that you've got your own stuff going on, and reshift the dynamic a bit so that you're both human beings, you both have things that, you could use support from others on. And then at some point, it may come down to having a difficult conversation about it and being really authentic about, how you're trying to take care of yourself and you care so much about them. And how is this actually impacting your health? Those difficult conversations are, part of the work of all of this here, and they're a big part of how we achieve those healthy boundaries.
Thank you. Anybody else have any tools? We're all really fantastic, and coming from healthcare burnout it's a great way to remind us, and also remind us that your point around this boundary shifting that's happening in organizations right now. It's, you know, it's uncomfortable for a lot of people, but it also is highly comfortable for others, right? It's kind of what many of us have been hoping for so long. That's a great answer to that question. Does anybody want to touch on, you know, how do you deal with a supervisor who's oversharing or over empathizing and not creating that space for you to have the same space?
Yeah, I'll piggyback. I mean, I think just pulling on that, right? It is around identifying what might be going on and how it's affecting you, especially if that person's your superior. I also go back to structure. If you have a structured agenda, if you leave little space for that, don't create the opening as much. Not that it's your fault, but you know, sometimes if you give people an inch, they'll take a mile. It can be a safer way to shut it down versus like, can we switch gears? Can we get to my deliverable? You know, if there's a few minutes for catch up on the agenda, or if instead of starting with how was your weekend, where you know they're going to take it left, and just getting to awesome, hope you had a good weekend. Now, right? There's little pivots that you can provide in those touch points. But I agree. Just, you know, if the dynamic has gotten really imbalanced or out of control, that person's responsible for you being set up for success. And so, you know, hopefully it's a safe enough relationship where you can just showcase what's been going on or how it's impacted your ability to do your work, either directly with them or with, again, an HR partner or someone else who can help intervene. Odds are this is happening unknowingly. And so just turning the lights on that might be enough for that person to pull back. And although that might feel uncomfortable, I think it's also really fair because you're there to do a job. So little space for humanity, but enough space for you to get done what you need to get done.
And to apply.
Maybe that person.
Sorry, go ahead, please.
No, I was going to say maybe that person needs help too. And, you know, when someone is an oversharing, it's because they may need help too. So you may need someone either in HR or in other places or yourself to go and mirror that back so they can find the help that they need.
Absolutely. Here's another, there's so many, and I want to try and capture most of them. Oftentimes you don't know if an organization is psychologically unsafe till it's too late. What are the key questions one should ask when networking or interviewing to help identify the red flags that our organization is psychologically unsafe?
The first one will be, so we'll build from, so the first one that I will ask is, how are decisions made in your group? Mm-hmm. So that would be a way to know how much of people really have a say in, or it comes all from the top. So that was my first. Who goes next? Let's build this together.
Yes. For those of you interviewing, because I know many of you probably are, here's your list of questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think you want to ask about ask something to the effect of what's something the organization could be doing better now? And then what you're looking for is there healthy self-examination? So can they identify some areas for improvement? No organization's perfect, so everyone should have something reasonable to answer there. But then the flip side is, are they just sort of listing off quote unquote failures that then tell you this is not a safe place to be taking risks? You know, oh, we went way too far in this direction and this person got up on their high horse, and, you know, all of that finger pointing and narratives around blame, not a good recipe for a psychologically safe environment.
That's great. Watching out for the narratives on blame.
Agree. Yeah. And I was kind of hamming it up, but I think literally going to page 20 of the Fearless Organization, looking at the scale, the items that are used to assess, you know, group and team and organizational level safety, and then, you know, converting those into, I think, individual questions to ask your prospective manager, right? Not just theorizing about mistakes and failure and safety, but like literally, can you tell me about a time when somebody, you know, those situational questions, that somebody made a mistake and, you know, what were the consequences? And that's not to say there aren't ever consequences for mistakes. Of course there are, but they should be appropriate and, you know, tailored to the gravity of that failure. I think is a great way to go. I also, again, I like to go back to data. And so I really encourage, if you're interviewing especially, for you to ask the recruiter, ask the manager themselves about any engagement survey data, any sort of team data that they have around the health of that department, health of that environment. I also encourage people to ask for diversity stats in the team or at the company. Like, get the quantitative, the objective information that might exist within that company, depending on how mature it is, because, you know, that is the source of truth.
Those are, now you've got all of your questions from when you're interviewing. And the one thing I will say is you should also get smart at being able to answer those questions if somebody asks you those questions, because these are the kinds of questions that I actually train my team in testing individuals as they're coming into the organization, because we want folks to come in that are going to be additive to our cultural DNA. So all fantastic questions. Hope that's helpful to the person who asked that question. I am going to ask this last question because we're almost at time. But I've seen different versions of this, but both my manager and second line are men. I am a woman. Do you feel it is more difficult to embrace vulnerability to someone of the opposite sex? And the counter to that is another question that I saw later in the thread of a lot of women feeling like the burden of vulnerability has fallen so deeply on them, as if all the men around them can't show any vulnerability or empathy. So I'm curious, you know, the question around, you know, is it more difficult to embrace vulnerability to someone of the opposite sex? And when the burden is on you because of gender biases, how do you address that? The three of you, let's build this next list together. I'm going to start with you, Gabriela.
Sure. So I don't necessarily think it's more difficult. I do think it can be different. The way that different people and certainly different genders show vulnerability is different. And that can take some learning and getting to know. I think that, you know, the right approach is probably really about treating each person as an individual. How well do you know them as an individual? What can you do to try to get to know them a bit better and start to create that feeling of closeness that you may be craving? The flip side of it, no woman should have to feel that they're carrying the empathy and the vulnerability for an organization. That's not our burden to bear. You know, you want to be able to embody that and lean into that to the extent it's meaningful to you, to the extent it draws from your values. But then as soon as you start to hit that empathy burnout, you've got to take a step back and really say, am I doing this for me, or am I doing it because of these social norms and expectations on me, and really put up those boundaries. For some women, they don't want to do that at all. And that's also perfectly fine. You do not have to be that person for your organization. You just want to come to it from a place of what is the tone and the nature of the culture I want to be a part of? How can I help advance that? Because it's something I want for myself. You don't need to, you know, be the poster child for it by any means.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. Erin, do you have anything else to add?
Sure. Well, just to tie back to something else we talked about, there is a conflation of gender in these caregiving roles within organizations, right? I'm in the diversity space. There's a lot of caregiving and empathy giving that is a part of my job, but there's also a lot that isn't. And so I think even if you are in kind of a caretaking or care seeming role for your company, it's still important to figure out what your role is and isn't. And even if you thought it was one thing, and to your point, Daisy, you are burnt out on caring for others, it is well within your right. It's actually, I think, your responsibility to pull back and create better boundaries and guardrails, because you can't give what you don't have. And so if it's just not working, you've got to figure out either if it's your role or not. If it's not, that's an easy out. If it is a part of your role, then just kind of tamping down on that container so that you have something a little bit more sustainable. And then that also leads to a previous question around kind of personal strategies to prevent sort of, you know, feeling too much. I don't know if you can. I would also just encourage folks to build kind of a self-caregiving practice. And, you know, I don't mean like getting your nails done, though that is fun. But really being able to, like, very fun. I just had my first manicure in a year and a half. Felt great. But really having, you know, a decompression and an outlet. Like for me, it's my therapist. For me, it's a whole daily routine. If I facilitated the session, I know that is going to feel like I ran a marathon. So I have a whole physical care routine. Figuring out just like what that might be for you and getting into a habit of that can help dispel what should be a normal and appropriate amount of feeling for others. We're not saying don't feel anything. And so I think part of this is rebounding.
Great. Elizabeth, final words.
Oh, I don't want to be the final words, but I'm going to tell a little story. So because of this gender, it's the stories that we tell to ourselves. So early in my career, I worked for a great manager. She was a woman, but she didn't have kids. I always felt that I could not share with her when my care, my getting to the daycare, and I was being late. That was my story. I don't really know. So that it was the same gender. So sometimes we feel more comfortable sharing and being vulnerable with those that have some of the same dimensions. And I had worked for men that have working wives, and therefore I could share that I was like crazy trying to get from school to daycare to the other one. So I think that it's less on gender and it's more about, do you have share experiences with that person that you need to be vulnerable so they will understand where you're coming from, but they also will see that you are working hard to perform at your best. And that's the two pieces that managers at the end of the day, they want to be sure that they create an inclusive environment where people can thrive.
Beautiful. Thank you, Elizabeth, Erin, and Gabriela. You've been brilliant. I'd now like to pass it over to Rebecca. Please take it away.
Thank you. I don't even know. Thank you so much to Shireen, Daisy, Gabriela, Elizabeth, Erin, all of you for such a great session. And thanks so much to all of you who joined the discussion today and everyone who's been in the chat, sharing so much with each other about their best practices. If this conversation got you thinking about what needs to change in your life and with your team, the best way to process and to make a plan of action is to attend one of our roundtables on Thursday afternoon or Friday morning. I'm certainly looking forward to talking through all of this at the Roundtable for Managers on Thursday afternoon, which I just dropped a link in the chat for. Throughout the week, we're going to be hosting conversations like this every day. So take a look at your calendar, take a look at our calendar, invite your friends to listen in to some of these conversations, and feel free to let us know your favorite parts and post on Twitter, Instagram with the hashtag Mobilize Women. I really hope you come away from this week seeing that through prioritizing and initiating conversations like this one, like this conversation we just had, together we can rebuild the equitable world that we all hope to have and that we all deserve. You, like all of you out there, really can help shape businesses to be more inclusive. Before we go, I want to say thank you to our Mobilize Women Week sponsors, particularly RBC Wealth Management, Accenture, Guardian Life, Verizon, Bungie, Baker Hostetler, Diageo, Robinson & Cole, Amalgamated Bank, Kiefer Women, Cornell MBA, Encourage Coaching, and Mutual of Omaha. We really couldn't do this without all of your support. We will be meeting tonight for a VIP wine tasting at happy hour at 5 p.m. If you want to join us. Our next major session is Innovation in a Time of Crisis, featuring Geetanjali Rao, who's America's top young scientist author and the Time Kid of the Year, and she's phenomenal. Maggie Lake, who's the founder at Maggie Lake Media, Katrine Marsal, a journalist and best-selling author, and Tracy Patterson, the managing director at Accenture. And that is tomorrow at noon Eastern. So I hope to see you all there and to see you tonight at 5 p.m. Eastern. Thank you again so much to all of you and for our speakers for sharing all of their stories.